an exegetical paper. I've copied 2 sample exegetical papers on the shared drive. They weren't there before, so I apologize. Some of you has let me know that you couldn't find them, and you were right. I got you mixed up with another class, that's why. But they are there now, so I encourage you to read them, to see them. The first one is on Ephesians chapter 2, and the second one is on Matthew 6. So do check those out, but you don't have to start working on that immediately. We will talk about exegesis in details after 2 weeks, after we're done with reader-centered approach. We will talk about how to actually do an exegetical paper. So exegesis basically is the practical aspect of hermeneutics, the actual process of hermeneutics. So I want us to cover the basics first. I want us to cover the concept, the theory behind it. So last week we've talked about author-centered approach and the importance of understanding the historical background, the cultural background of the author. We will talk about the importance of the text, and we'll talk about text-centered approach today. And next week, I plan to talk about reader-centered approaches. And after that, we will talk about exegesis by integrating these 3 major approaches. So hermeneutics, as we said last week, has 3 major approaches. As I've mentioned, some prefer to follow a single approach. Some are known for their historical approach, for their author-centered approach. Others, I believe, overemphasize the text-centered approach, and others emphasize the reader-centered approach. But as I've mentioned already, I do not think those 3 are mutually exclusive. I believe those 3 can be held together, and that's what we at least will try to do when we do our exegesis. So I want us to cover the basics first, these 3 approaches very briefly, and then we will have a session on how to integrate those 3 and have a working model for an exegesis. So we will talk about that. But till then, I encourage you to read the sample exegetical papers I've copied in the shared drive. I also encourage you to read the epistle to the Hebrews. So your paper is going to be an exegetical paper on Hebrews 12. So the first step is to actually understand the letter. So I encourage you to read the letter in its entirety, starting from chapter 1 through chapter 13. So do that and be familiar with those. You can also start preparing materials for the exegetical paper, commentaries, and so do that till next week, that is. And after that, I will actually give you a list of steps to follow, and you will start working on your exegetical paper, Malitra. Other than that, the next requirement is lesson reports. We will get to them. I believe the first one is due on the 3rd of November. Not on 3rd. It's going to be on December 1st, I believe. So no, 24th of November. So it will be right after we discuss OT narrative. So these are like homeworks. They are ways for you to practice what we actually talk about in class. So I will give you more details when that approach. And the detailed instruction is found on the course syllabus as well. And the next one, and I believe the most important one, is your reading log. I encourage you to read the assigned readings and register your reading. I encourage you to actually engage with the material, as I've already mentioned. The best way for you to learn at this level is to read and to write. So read the assigned readings and read them faithfully. As I've already said, this particular assessment is based on trust. I trust you to be truthful and to read the assigned readings, and I will collect the reading log at the end of class. at the end of semester, that is. So I encourage you to start reading. It's very, very important that you read. Other than that, there will be an exam also. It will consist of the assigned readings. So do that. I believe it will be on. The plan is okay. I think the plan. Okay, I think the plan is it's going to be a final exam, so it will be at the end of semester. So I also encourage you to prepare for that, and the way you prepare for that is to actually start reading the assigned readings. So the reading log and the exam, they actually feed each other. So be encouraged. Do let me know if there are issues I can help you with regarding the course. Start reading. Let know. Okay, so let's try to revise what we've discussed last week. And I want to say a couple of things about author-centered approach, and we will start talking about text-centered approach. So those of you who were present last week, what do you remember from our discussion? What did we talk about? Give me a summary of what you remember. Yes, go ahead, Asafa.
Okay, thank you very much. The last week's our discussion of last week was about the issue of approach to hermeneutics, and as an introduction, the three approaches like the author-centered approach, the text-centered approach, reader-centered approach were raised. And actually, as I read from the materials that you suggested, there is also what we call an integrated approach to hermeneutics also. And
Yes.
in detail, what we discussed was the issue of author-centered approach. As you said earlier, these three are not, they should not be just seen as mutually exclusive actually. They just work together, and specifically when we talk about the author-centered approach to hermeneutics, it is an interpretative approach that seeks meaning to the culture, history, ideology of the author. The author or the writer is just intended to show a certain meaning about who the author is, what kind of person is he, is a young man, old man, a Jewish, a Gentile, or what kind of person he is. Just creating a kind of profile about the author. That means in interpreting that way, the author is very important. Understanding the author takes a long time, actually, as you said. Um, anyway, what kind of relationship does have with his audience is also raised during the discussion. And in this approach, just understanding the author is very essential. The ideology, the history behind the author, and also some issues about understanding. In order to understand, there are tools in order the language of the author, for example, how the language the author used was the grammar, the context of the author was just raised during the discussion. In order to understand the language and the grammar, you have just suggested us to look at three important things like Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias, like lexic and word level dictionaries, the concordance and the like, were just issues to be considered in order to understand the grammar and the language the author has just used. And the second thing that we've seen was about the historical and ideological background of the author in the text. Because when the author is just write something, he didn't just written it in a vacuum. A certain history and a certain ideology was there. Therefore, understanding these issues are very essential in understanding the author-centered approach to hermeneutics. That was the thing that I just understand from the lesson of last week.
Yes, thank you. That was a very good summary. Is there anyone else who want to add to what Asafa said? Yes, Asir. You have to unmute yourself if you're speaking, Yasser.
Thank you. Asif clarified in detail. I have question regarding to reading log. Sorry,
Sure.
did you attach all the reading logs, the book?
Yes, it's in the OneDrive folder. It's a
Okay,
table. Yes, it just tracks what you've read. It's like a progress tracker. So
okay, thank you.
do that. Sure. Okay. Uh, let's proceed to today's discussion. Before going to text-centered hermeneutics, I want to say a few things about what we call the historical critical method. It actually is an important example to understand the author-centered approach. So we will talk about that just to make you familiar with some of the methods that are included in what's broadly labeled as the historical critical method. So after that, we'll talk about uh, text-centered approach to hermeneutics. Okay, so the historical critical method, or it's a method, as you can see from its name. It's a methodology. It's sometimes called generally historical criticism. So when it comes to terms like this, you might find different labels, different terms used to essentially say the same thing. So you have to make sure that you understand how a specific author defines this kind of thing. So some people prefer to call it the historical critical method. Some might simply call it the critical method. Some might call it historical criticism. So it's essentially the same thing. So it's not a single method actually. It's an approach, or it's a set of methodologies that seeks to answer questions concerning the historical origins of the biblical texts. So as I've already discussed last week, somebody needs to mute Asafa. You have to mute yourself. There is an echo coming. Okay. So this set of methods seeks to answer the issues concerning the historical origins of the biblical texts. So as I've mentioned in passing a couple of weeks ago, the biblical text as we know it, the canon as we know it, has gone through a very long and complex historical process. So the historical critical method seeks to understand this process, generally speaking. So as I've already said, it's not a single method, but there are at least 4 methods that are included in it. The first one is called textual criticism, or sometimes it's called lower criticism. Textual criticism seeks to establish as accurate a text as possible. So this approach assumes that before trying to interpret a text, before trying to do an exegesis, it's important to have a static text, that is a text that we are sure of. For example, as you know, the biblical text we have comes from a variety of ancient manuscripts. As you know, there is at least almost a 2,000 years gap between the first text to be written in the Bible and the last text to be written in the Bible. So there is, and we don't really have one set of manuscripts that includes everything, that has every possible textual variant solved and all that. The biblical text, as we know, that actually is developed, actually constructed using a variety of processes that we generally call textual criticism. So, for example, think of the Paul's letter to the Romans, and we don't really have what Paul has actually written to the church in Rome, as you know. We instead have copies of that letter that has been that has been in a long process of transmission. So we potentially have a copy of a copy of a copy of what Paul has actually written. So we have, for example, a manuscript that we call P46 that have a collection of the Pauline corpus, and there are also a variety of other manuscripts that have a varying amount of usefulness to actually construct the text. So reaching to a static text, a workable text, is a process. We call that criticism textual criticism. It's an attempt to actually have a static text to work with. For example, let me show you what I'm talking about. Biblical manuscripts. Okay. So this papyrus, you see, is actually called P52, and it is the earliest textual witness in the New Testament we have. It's from the Gospel of John, and it actually consists of John 18 verses 31 through 33 and verses 37 through 38. So this, for example, is one source, one manuscript that we have. As you can see, it's very fragmented, and it only has 4 verses in it. So this is the earliest manuscript we have, and it actually is dated in the 2nd century, that is from 125 to 175 AD. So it probably is a copy of a copy of a copy. So the kind of manuscripts we have are like this. Some are more complete than others. Some are more trustworthy than others, and some are, uh, for example, there are textual families that are more reliable and that are less reliable, and all that. In the New Testament, we have around 5,800 manuscripts. So in order to get to the kind of text that we know in our Bibles, we need to actually treat this kind of manuscripts and reach a static, workable textual evidence. So the process that tries to actually establish the original wording of the text, the original manuscript that potentially was written by the biblical writers, is what we call textual criticism. So the first step to do an actual exegesis is to actually establish the text, right? So textual criticism is actually the first step whenever we do an exegesis. So it can be argued that we already have translations, right? And our translations are most reliable. So we don't really need to do proper exegesis when we actually try to exegete a certain passage. For example, when you would try to exegete Hebrews 12 for your assignment, you are not expected to actually perform the long process, the long textual process uh, that original textual critics have to do. But there are exceptions in the Bible where there are textual variants. You can see this, for example, if you read the NIV. The NIV gives footnotes of potential textual variants. It doesn't try to resolve them. Most translations actually resolve these textual variants and give you their understanding of the text, but NIV prefers to list the textual variants to actually give you that there is some debate in a certain verse rather than give you an interpretive approach. So if the text, I don't know how many of you are first year students and how many of you have taken Greek, but if you actually have taken Greek, I encourage you to try to do proper textual criticism, and we will talk about that when you talk about exegetical steps. But to actually go back to the Greek text and see the textual variants that are there, and try to decide which which you prefer, which textual variant you prefer, if whether you agree with textual critics on a certain variant or not. But if you actually are not familiar with Greek, if you haven't taken, for example, this doesn't require you to take sophisticated Greek. If you have already taken Greek 1, for example, you can approach this. You can actually go back to the Greek text itself and see the options and read the arguments for and against, for example, a certain textual variant, and decide for yourself. So textual criticism tries to do this. It takes into consideration all the various textual ancient manuscripts we have of the New Testament and the Old Testament, and compare them with each other, and try. It's a complex process. It's a field on its own. Textual critics are professionals on their own right, and it tries to reach to a static text that's believed to be as close as possible to original of what the New Testament writers or the Old Testament writers have actually written. So the first step is to actually establish text we want to interpret. The first step is to actually establish the text that we want to read. So textual criticism tries to do that. But if you're not familiar with Greek, you can, for example, consult the NIV. The NIV, as I've already said, gives you major textual variants. Let me show you, for example. So, for example, let's go to my Romans 8, where I know that there is textual variant, for example, in verse. So, in verse 2, I believe, you see, for example, it tells you that some manuscripts actually read this specific place as who according to the flesh. So if you are using the hard copy version, it gives the list of the textual variants that are there in footnotes. For example, I mean, and when I speak, if you are reading the Amharic version, you can also consult the አዲሱ መደበኛ ትርጉም ማለት ነው። The NIV is quite close with አዲሱ መደበኛ ትርጉም. And for example, concert Mark 16, as you know, there is a huge textual issue when it comes to Mark 16, and it gives you, for example, since Mark 16 is a huge chunk of material, it brackets it off like this, and it tells you that the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. So if you are trying, for example, if you are trying to interpret Mark 16, your first step will be to establish the existence of that portion of reading. So textual criticism pretty much tries to do this. It consults all ancient manuscripts. As you know, these manuscripts can be papyrus, some are on parchments, and it tries to reach to a static text that is as much close as possible to what the biblical writers might have actually written. So this is what we call textual criticism. So it's an important part of the historical critical method, and it's an important. It actually should be the first step whenever you try to interpret a text, to exegete a text, especially academically, especially if you are, for example, writing for your thesis, writing for an assignment. The first step is to actually consult that the text you're working with is as much as possible close to what the original writers might have written. So I can't really get into the details of how textual variants might have occurred, how to resolve them, or the textual families. That's a bit outside the scope of this course, but you need always the text first. So if you are comfortable with Greek, for example, for your assignment, I encourage you to go back to the Greek text and see whether there are textual variants that exist in Hebrews 12. But if you're not, you can simply consult the NIV or any other English version that has this feature, and see whether what you're actually reading is as much close as possible to the textual, to what the biblical writers might have written. So this is what's commonly called as textual criticism. Uh, so this is the first step, and this is the first method that's actually included in what's commonly called as the historical critical method. And second one is what we call source criticism. Source criticism is as you know, source criticism try to try to identify the sources that the biblical writers might have used to actually write what they have written. So this approach assumes that the biblical writers have used sources in order to construct their narratives, their argument, and source criticism tries to identify sources behind the biblical text. For example, as you are reading the PowerPoint, for example, you might try to identify what kind of books I've consulted in order to come up with this source, with this material, with this PowerPoint slide. So source critics do the same thing when it comes to the biblical texts. I assume that the biblical writers were conversant with the various sources that were accessible in their time. So they try to identify what kind of sources they have used to construct their material. So we will talk about this in detail in a while. And third approach is what we call form criticism. Form criticism actually tries to identify the oral units behind the biblical text, and more importantly, it tries to identify what kind of setting might have given rise to those texts. So we will actually try to define that as well. And the fourth one is reduction criticism. It tries to trace the editorial work behind the finished material. So there is a conventional view that the historical critical method originated as a result of the Enlightenment, which is true to some extent, but it would be wrong to assume that the early church didn't practice these methods, because we see, for example, there was an attempt to do textual criticism early on. For example, in second, third century, we see the church fathers writing the various textual variants in a column in order to understand which reading is the best reading. We also see them try to do source criticism. For example, when it comes to the synoptic gospels, there was an attempt to harmonize them, to identify the source behind them and all that. So it is true that the historical critical method was developed systematically and academically post-Enlightenment, but it's not entirely correct that the church were not interested in this critical approach before the Enlightenment period. But it's good to remember that the church actually was concerned of some of the issues that the historical critical method tries to resolve. So textual criticism, as I've already said, is the scholarly process of examining the various manuscripts and fragments of the biblical text, and it tries to determine the most accurate and original wording of the text. I believe I've explained this in detail, so let's proceed to source criticism. Source criticism assumes that many of the biblical writings were constructed from earlier sources. This is not as radical as it might sound at first, because the Bible itself gives us clues that the biblical writers actually used source material. For example, in the Old Testament, the writers give us a names of books that we are not familiar with, and they in a way refer us to those books. For example, after telling us the battles of a certain king, they tell us that the rest is to be found in the book of the wars of the Lord, for example, or in the book of Jasher. ስለዚህ በዚህ መጽሐፍ ተጽፎ የለምን የሚለው ማለት ነው አማርኛው። So they are in a way giving us source material. They are telling us that they have used that source when they are writing about this history. So the biblical writers, for example, the Old Testament, sometimes trace histories that last hundreds of years. So they necessarily have to use sources in order to come up with that narrative. They are not inventing it as they write. So they have to depend on existing sources. They have to depend on source materials in order to construct their narratives. They have to use primary sources. They have to use oral traditions that was passed down in their community. So there are sources that the biblical writers used in order to write their material. The same can be seen in the New Testament as well. For example, Paul refers to the tradition that he has received. He says, for example, this is not from me, this comes directly from the Lord. As you know, Paul was not familiar with the Lord physically, so he must be referring to what he's heard from the disciples, for example, that the Lord has said something like this. Or think of 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, I give you what I've received. I've received this. tells them የተማርኩትን የማውቀውን የሰማሁትን ነው የምነግራችሁ ያላችሁን የተቀበልኩትን ነው ለእናንተ የምነግራችሁ ብሎ tells them what sounds like a confession, what sounds like a creed, right? That Christ died for sin. So those are clues that there were pools of materials, these materials don't necessarily have to be rewritten. This might be oral sources, for example, that the biblical writers used in order to write what we have currently, what we call, for example, the Old Testament and New Testament. Luke, for example, tells us that he has done something like this. He says that many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. He tells us that before him there are many who have written what happened in and around Galilee in the first century. So he tells us there are many that have written. So he might be referring to the Gospel of Mark and the other Gospels, and he might actually be referring to other sources that we don't currently possess. And he went on to say, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. See, he is giving you his sources. His sources, for example, as you know, Luke was not an eyewitness to Christ, right? He was not an eyewitness. He was not one of the 12. So he tells us that these sources, these stories, the events that have been fulfilled among us, that revolve around Christ, those were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. So he is telling us that his sources, for example, one group that served as a source for Luke were the eyewitnesses, those who actually saw Jesus, those who actually followed Jesus, those who actually received miracles from him, for example, those who actually learned from him. So he is telling us that they were his source. He, in a way, is telling us, giving us his methodology. So his first were the eyewitnesses. So in a way, he has interviewed the eyewitnesses, ማለት ነው. So he's telling us that the eyewitnesses were a source, see, and servants of the word. He's talking about the apostles here. So the apostles, the 12. So he's telling us that he actually has two sources, two groups of sources. The first one are the eyewitnesses. The eyewitnesses are those that were present when Jesus, for example, heals a certain person, when Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus walks on water. And there are also servants of the word who were a close confidant of the Lord. So Luke is telling us that these are my sources, and I've given an orderly account from this. So source criticism tries to identify the sources. So they try to answer, which material came from which source. So sometimes these source critics might go as far as to say that a certain person is responsible for this material, but oftentimes they give you a broad idea. For example, if Luke was not present during the Sermon on the Mount, somebody present might have given him that. So those who heard what Jesus actually taught was a source for him. So source criticism. So as I've already said last week, this author-centered approach, they had a tendency to go behind the text, right? To go to spend a whole lot of time in the background world of the author. And source criticism pretty much does that. It tries to see the various sources that are in play in a finished material. For example, again, think of this PowerPoint slide. This PowerPoint slide I might have depended on, for example, 3 separate books in order to come up with this slide. So source critics try to identify which book influenced which part, which part came from which book. So the third paragraph might come from Bloomberg, the first one might come from, I don't know, Osborne, something like that. So source criticism tries to do that. So it's a process. There are various ways of doing that. It's really a complex process. They take textual clues to separate by different sources and all that. We can't get into that, but I just want you to be familiar with what source criticism actually is. Another evidence that the biblical writers used earlier sources is that there are overlapping narratives, right? We see this both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. For example, there is similarity between Chronicles to Samuel and Kings, right? So how do you explain that similarity? The best, the most probable case is that one has depended on the other in order to come up with that. As I've mentioned last week, I believe the chronicler seems to have depended on the rest. So the chronicler has a post-exilic perspective on what's actually been written in First and Second Kings, and the same is evident in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this actually is very evident, and it has a name. It's called the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem is a literary problem that tries to explain the textual and sequential similarities and differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As I'm sure you've noticed in your Bible study, even in your personal study, without this critical approach, there is a glaring amount of similarity between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The only gospel that significantly differs both in content and in style is the Gospel of John. So how do you explain the similarities between Mark, Matthew, and Luke? The most probable cause is that one was a source, one was used as a source. So the scholarly consensus is that Mark was the first to be written, and Matthew and Luke seem to have depended on Mark in order to write their gospels. There is also a possibility that there was another written source that is actually lost now. So as you know, there are places where Matthew and Luke agree with each other almost verbatim, but that's absent in the Gospel of Mark. So the Gospel of Mark can't be the source for everything. So scholars oftentimes call that source Quelle, which means source in German. So there, the consensus is that the Gospel writers used Mark, Luke and Matthew used Mark and Q as a source in order to write their Gospel material. So sources are present in the Bible. The biblical writers used sources, and source criticism tries to identify the sources behind the finished product we have. So there are a lot of examples to see how the Gospels agree almost verbatim and show a limited amount of difference. For example, you can see this on your own time. For example, consult Matthew 21, Mark 11, and Luke 20, where they talk about the incident and temple where Jesus cleansed the temple. And it becomes evident that they are depending on the same source, and each writer puts their own editorial touch, their own theological interpretation to what actually happens there. So this is what we call the synoptic problem. It tries to answer why they are similar and why they differ at the same time. So I believe you will learn about this when you take course on the Synoptic Gospels. Okay, third one is what we call form criticism. Form criticism is the identification and analysis of forms. Forms are conventional patterns that are employed in a specific context. For example, think of financial reports. Financial reports tend to follow the same pattern. For example, think of an email. An email tends to follow the same form. For example, you expect to see a subject, and then you expect to find a greeting, and then you try to find uh, the body's actual content of the email, and then you try to find a well wish and the signature of the sender. So so this pattern, you can see that there is actually a literary pattern in emails. The same is true, for example, if you think about wedding invitations. Think of wedding invitations in Ethiopia. When you think of wedding invitations, you expect a verse from the scriptures to come at first, right? And then you expect to read your name down there, and then you expect to read where the venue is, when, and you finally expect to read those who actually sent your invitation, right? So writings, literary outputs follow patterns. For example, the same is true in job applications, in prescriptions, right? The same is true when it comes to the biblical material as well. Uh, for example, form criticism tries to identify these ancient forms in the Bible, this kind of forms in the Bible. For example, there are the formulaic I sayings in the Gospel of John. There are, for example, prophetic forms in the Old Testament. For example, there are war reports in the Old Testament that tend to follow the same pattern, and there are also what we call narratives, for example, that are very discernible. We will see one example, so don't worry. So form criticism tries to identify the literary forms employed in the biblical writings. So it is primarily concerned to identify, to categorize them in order to understand their pattern ማለት ነው. So once you understand, for example, a pattern for a certain form, then you will know what to expect, and you will interpret them in that light. So there are, for example, proverbs, legal sayings, parables, for example, are forms. More importantly, after identifying a form, it tries to identify the life setting of these forms. So the German you see means life setting. It tries to answer what kind of context, what kind of situation might have preserved those forms. For example, whenever you see a prescription, you you imagine a medical context, right? Whenever you see a wedding invitation, you imagine the context. So identifying the forms helps what kind of contexts might have given rise to those writings. For example, if you see when you see a prophetic saying, you might you might imagine a setting, a temple related setting. If you see a regional report or a war report, you might expect a temple related context. I mean, a palace related context. And when you see legal sayings, for example, you might expect a council of sorts or a court like setting. So understanding the setting helps. So form criticism tries to identify these two things. It tries to identify the form a certain pericope, a certain reading follows, a certain literary output follows, and it tries to identify the context that might have given rise to that form ማለት ነው. For example, think of as commonly called as a call narrative. A call narrative form. This form is evident both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So this form, you can distinguish this call whenever you read the call narrative of Moses, Gideon, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and even Mary in the New Testament. ይህ ማለት ሙሴ፣ ጌዲዮን፣ ሕዝቅኤል ለአገልግሎት ሲጠሩ ያለውን ጽሁፎች ኮምፔር ብታደርጓቸው ተመሳሳይ ፎርም ፎሎ ያደርጋሉ። there are similarities. So the first one is there will be a divine confrontation. So an angel of God might appear and confront that specific person, and that divine agent will introduce himself in all cases. So in the case of Mary, for example, Gabriel ነኝ ይላታል, and then the commission comes. The will of the Lord is actually expressed. So the Lord wants to do this with you, or the Lord wants you to go there or to do that. So, and after that, an objection comes, right? In the Bible, whenever a call narrative is being expressed, there's almost always an objection from the human element, right? Mary objects, for example, Gideon objects, right? Moses objects, Isaiah objects, right? Isaiah, so there is that objection. And then the reassurance comes. The divine agent will reassure the person who is being called, right? The person is reassured. And then there will be a sign. They will ask a sign. They will ask for a sign, or the divine agent himself will promise for a sign, right? For example, in Isaiah chapter 6 and 7, after the call narrative in chapter 6, in the next chapter we find a sign, right? አማኑኤል የሚለው ማለት ነው። ድንግል ትጸንሳለች የሚለው ክፍል ማለት ነው። When it comes to the case of Mary, for example, the angel tells us that her aunt Elizabeth will also be pregnant, and that should be a sign for Mary. Same is true for Moses. Same is true for Gideon. Gideon asks for signs, as you all remember. So they all follow the same pattern. So form critics try to identify these patterns. This is also visible in the New Testament, by the way. For example, there is what's usually called as a miracle story in the Gospels. So whenever a miracle appears, the way it is reported seems to follow a certain pattern. For example, the first one is that a need is established, that is, the condition of the person to be healed will be expressed, and the author will tell us the actual problem first, and then we see that specific person seeking Jesus' help, and then Jesus will seek obedience or faith from that person to be followed. Jesus will ask, "Do you believe?" Right? ታምናለህ ብሎ ይጠይቃል ጌታ. And then the actual miracle is performed. And then they tell us how the characters in the story respond to that specific healing. So ሰዎች ተገረሙ ሊሆን ይችላል፣ ሰዎች ሊገሉት ፈለጉ ሊሆን ይችላል, but the response is reported to us in this pattern. So the existence of this pattern doesn't mean that the event didn't occur. As I've already said, it actually points towards a pattern, a form that the biblical writers were employing when they were reporting a certain thing ማለት ነው. Anyways, again, this is also a field of study in its own terms, in its own right. So we can't get into the details of it, how to identify forms, how to identify a life setting. We can't really get into that, but I want you to be familiar with what form criticism is. So the third part of the historical critical method is what we call the form criticism. The fourth one is what we call reduction criticism. Reduction means editing, simply speaking. Reduction criticism focuses on how the final authors or compilers of a biblical writing edited their materials. So, for example, think of the New Testament, the Synoptic Gospels, as I've said. We can discern that Matthew, Mark, and Luke seems to have shared a source. However, even though they shared a source or sources, the way they edited the source, the way they organized the final material, the way they edited it. So whenever you think of the biblical writers, you shouldn't simply think of them as writers. You should also think them as editors. So they were also editing, okay. So the editorial touch is what pretty much the field that tries to identify the editorial touches of the biblical writers is what we call the reduction criticism. So, for example, when I previously talked about the chronicler, for example, I said he seems to have a post-exilic perspective of what First and Second Kings reports, right? So, for example, when I say that, I'm trying to identify his editorial role by giving him a post-exilic perspective. I'm saying he has edited it in a way that best reflected a post-exilic situation. So the same can be said in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For example, Matthew seems to have organized the materials about Jesus, eyewitness testimonies, and those that came from the apostles in a way that best deals with a Jewish context, for example, right? So that's the editorial touch of Matthew. What actually happened is the same, right? What Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what three of them try to report actually happens, actually is the same thing, but the way they organize their material, the way they edit the material, is what reduction criticism tries to identify. Think of, for example, uh, Ethiopian history, for example. Ethiopian history, while depending on a very limited few primary sources, can reflect the editorial inclinations of the writers, right? For example, a certain person writing from a certain perspective interprets the primary source in a certain way, right? That's what we call an editorial touch. So the biblical writers also has this role. The biblical writers were not simply writers; they were also editing, interpreting, translating primary sources that actually occurred in their time. The best example, as I've already read, is what Luke tells us, right? Luke tells us that many have written, and I know what they've written, but my plan is to give you an orderly account, depending on the eyewitness testimony and what the apostles teach. So that's reduction criticism. Reduction criticism tries to identify the editorial touch, tries to answer how the biblical writers organize the material. Why, for example, a certain pericope appears at first. For example, think of the temple cleansing incident that I mentioned earlier. For example, it appears at the end of the Synoptic Gospels, right? They tell us that the temple cleansing actually happened in the final week of Jesus, the Synoptic Gospels. But John actually puts it in chapter 2 of his Gospel, if you remember, right? He chooses to present to us that incident uh, at first of the Gospel. That means John wants us to understand what actually happens to Jesus through that mirror. So that's an editorial decision. He is reorganizing the material in a way that best communicates his theological message. So reduction criticism tries to identify this kind of editorial moves and try to articulate why a certain author has a certain editorial perspective. So that's reduction criticism. For example, think of this simple statement uh, from Luke and Matthew. For example, Luke tells us that Jesus said, "Blessed in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are you who are poor." So Luke tells us that Jesus said, "Blessed are you who are poor," but Matthew prefers to interpret this as "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Now, as I've already said, both Matthew and Luke seem to depend on Mark and on Q, another source. But the way they report this saying of Jesus is a bit different, right? So why does this difference occur, and what does this tell us about the theological interest of Matthew and Luke separately? So, for example, this might be that as you know, Luke is very much interested in the marginalized, in the poor, and socially outcast throughout his gospel. So he might be making the conscious decision uh, to emphasize the social aspect of being poor as well. So this is a kind of questions reduction Christian tries to answer. So the first one is reduction Christian, and it's quite important that you understand it. So in a way, when we do exegesis, especially if we are if we are if you are doing an exegetical paper on the synoptic gospels, reduction criticism is very important. If you are doing an exegetical paper on First and Second Kings, on Chronicles, where there is a parallel text, where there is an overlapping of narrative in the biblical material, you have to have this consciousness that actually the theological message of the book, for example, the theological message of Matthew and Luke, is actually best reflected in a way they shape their materials. So as I've already said, the primary material they are using is the same, but the way they interpret it and the way they present it is tells us what the specific context they are working in is. So that's why this is especially important, as I've said, when there is an overlapping of narratives, just like we find in the case of the Synoptic Gospels. So in order to understand Matthew, Luke, and Mark better, you have to have this perspective. Other than that, it's simply it's going to be a repetitive, right? So the reason I believe that God intended Luke, Matthew, and Mark to be included in the canon, even though they are quite similar in many ways, especially in the primary source, is that their interpretation matters, right? Their editorial touch matters, and the best way to understand their editorial touch is to do reduction criticism. So, as I've said, we can't really get into how to do reduction criticism, but it's quite easy. The first one is, for example, if you are working on the Synoptic Gospels, compare and contrast the pericope. Compare how Matthew presents it, how Mark presents it, and how Luke presents it, and it tells you where the theological emphasis lies in each book. So this is reduction criticism. So the historical critical method pretty much includes this process, and each method developed in time. Really, it was a process. It was, for example, reduction criticism really arose as a response to source criticism and form criticism, because source criticism and form criticism, they had a tendency to fragment the Bible, right? So the source critics, they tried to go as back as possible in order to identify the first source of each material. So they had a tendency to fragment the text. The same is true for form criticism as well. It had a tendency to atomize the text, but reduction criticism came up as a response. It pretty much argued that the final product also matters. Not only the source, but the final product actually matters, and it's important to understand how the final editor, the editorial touch behind the text, had decided to organize the text ማለት ነው. So this is what we call the historical critical method, and in fact, textual text-centered hermeneutics in a way, at least the modern understanding of text-centered hermeneutics came up as a response to the historical critical method, because, as I've already said, the historical critical method tended to dwell on the background of the text. It studied a whole lot about what went on behind the text. So text-centered hermeneutics, as we will see, it was developed as a response to this overemphasis. So if you have questions, I believe you have some. So let me tackle those. And I want to say a little bit about text-centered hermeneutics before finishing for today. So is there something unclear about what I've said? Uh, or is it clear enough? Do you have any question? I understand that some of it might sound a bit new, especially if you are first-year students. So feel free to ask. So it's available in detail in the assigned readings. So I encourage you to read in order to understand them. Any question, beloveds? Yes, Asafa, go ahead.
Okay, mine is maybe simply a term. My question is,
Sure.
when we were talking about this historical critical method,
Mhm.
in the terms like source criticism, form criticism, reduction criticism, and text criticism, I have just a question on the word criticism. When I was
Sure.
just reading the material itself, I was confused with the word. I understand before in the academia that criticism is just something that you criticize. For example, when we talk about textual criticism, it is something about criticizing or just debating that
Mhm.
issue under textual or something. But in this
Yeah.
case, I don't think that connotation is just going on. It might be in a different way.
Yes, you're
I was
right.
just confused. It's just simply say on the word itself,
Yes,
criticism.
when you read criticism in academia, it's important to think of criteria. Think of analyzing a text based on a certain criteria. So it doesn't have a negative connotation at all. It doesn't mean negatively. It doesn't mean negatively attacking a certain thing or something like that. It simply means to analyze something based on a criteria, based on a pre-agreed upon criteria. So the criteria used when it comes to source criticism is different from the criteria used when it comes to form criticism. That's why they are different. But the word criticism itself doesn't have a negative connotation in and of itself. In and of itself. So think of analyzing the biblical text using a pre-agreed upon criteria.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, sure. That's a good question. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. If not, let's proceed to text-centered hermeneutics. As we talked about last week, there are three major approaches to to hermeneutics in general. So the first one is what we've discussed last week, the author-centered approach, which emphasizes the role of the author in order to understand the text better, in order to reach to the meaning. It emphasizes the role of the author. So what's actually desired in author-centered approach is the authorial meaning. That is what the author intended. So text-centered hermeneutics is another aspect of it, another major approach when it comes to hermeneutics. This interpretation focuses on the text and its structure as the source of meaning. So in this approach, meaning, the desired meaning is the textual meaning, it's not the authorial meaning. Or in this approach, text meaning actually lies in the text itself, not in the world of the author or behind the text. So it emphasizes that the text itself is sufficient in order to understand the text. So the backbone of text-centered interpretation is its emphasis on artistic strategies, on literary forms, on textual coherence, and all. It it treats the text as text. It believes that the text is in and of itself sufficient. This doesn't mean that historical background doesn't really matter, but it focuses it rather focuses that the meaning actually lies in the text, even though we might go back to the world of the author in order to the world of the text in order to understand some historical background. It argues that it's still the text is the final arbiter of meaning. So meaning actually lies in the text, not behind the text. So it believes that the text is autonomous. They believe that the author is dead. The author is actually dead, right? So we can't go back to consult him or to consult her. So the focus is on the text itself. It also emphasizes that the text must be treated as a whole. This really is a response to what we've said when we talk about source criticism. as we said, source criticism had a tendency to fragment the text, to mutilate the text in order in its attempts to go to identify the sources of the text. So ሶርስን ለማግኘት በሚል ሙከራ ሶርስ ክሪቲሲዝም ቴክስቱን የመበጣጠስ ቴንደንሲ ያለው እንደተነጋገር ነው right. So in a way this approach was developed as a response to the historical critical method. This approach emphasized that the text is a unity. It should be treated as a unity, that it's not important, to try to identify the sources behind the text. So it emphasizes that the text is a unity, it's a whole. We don't need to we don't need to fragment it in order to understand it better. So this is like a presupposition of text-centered approach. They approach the text as a finished whole. ስለዚህ ቴክስቱን ሲያዩት አሁን ባለበት ፎርም ነው እንጂ አፕሮች የሚያደርጉት ወደ ኋላ ለመሄድ ለመሰነጣጠቅ አይሞክሩም ማለት ነው። ከየት መጣ ሶርሱ ምንድነው የሚሉ ጥያቄዎች they are not their concern. So they don't see the finished product as a patchwork of fragments. Rather, they assume that there is a coherence, there is textual unity. So in a way, it focuses on what we've called the reduction process, the editing process. So they presuppose that the text as we have it now is important, and identifying the source behind it is not the primary task of the exegete. In addition to this, it focuses on the literary genres of the Bible of a certain text. So it emphasizes that literary genre matters, form matters. So it tries to understand the Bible as literature, literary reading of the Bible, or text-centered hermeneutics approaches the Bible as a literature. It assumes that the biblical writers wrote using the literary conventions of their time. So for example, when it tries to understand Hebrew poetry, for example, it tries to read the text in light of Hebrew poetry of that time. For example, when it tries to understand Hebrew narrative, it tries to understand the biblical material based on the standards of Hebrew narrative of that time, of the biblical time. So text-centered approach, they emphasize the importance of the text itself in order to understand the textual meaning ማለት ነው። As I've already said, this approach was developed mainly as a reaction against the 19th and early 20th century scholarship that insisted on looking behind the text to achieve meaning. So the Bible was almost used as a historical source. Primarily, it was used to understand the history. The focus was about tracing the transmission process of the biblical material. They tried to identify the biblical source behind. So, the power of the academia was invested on understanding what actually went on behind the text. So in a way, text-centered approaches or reading the Bible as literature, or what's commonly known as literary reading, was a response. It was a response to that approach, to the focus of the 19th and 20th century on what went on behind the text. So this new approach, rather than fragmenting the text, focused on approaching the text as a unity, as a whole, and it came to prominence during the 1930s and the 1940s, right around when author-centered approach, or when the historical critical method in a way reached its peak. So it was a response. So it's sometimes called as especially the modern version of it. The modern version of text-centered approach is called new criticism. So if you read new criticism, think of text-centered approach. Okay. Even though this approach matured in the 20th century, or it was done as science in the 20th century, it doesn't mean that it was a new thing. It actually was a very old concept. And the majority of the early church fathers, for example, they tended to pit classical literature against the Bible. They were hesitant to read the Bible as they read any other literature. So they were hesitant to treat the Bible as literature. But there were exceptions like Augustine, who recognized that the literary natures of the scripture need to be considered in order to understand the text better. So even though there were church fathers that were suspicious to see the text as literature, but there were at the same time those who recognized the importance of understanding the literature of uh, the time in order to understand the Bible better. So, in a way, text-centered hermeneutics or reading the Bible as literature emphasizes that we should read, for example, texts as we would read any other literature. This doesn't mean that we forget that the Bible is the Word of God or that we treat it as a fiction or something like that. It simply means that we need to recognize that the biblical writers operated within the literary framework of their time. So, for example, when they wrote for us psalms and poems, we need to understand that uh, they followed the literary conventions of their time. When they tell us a certain story or a certain narrative, it simply means that we need to recognize they used the norm of their time, the literary norm of their time. So, for example, when we try to understand, when we read the Bible as literature means to understand its genre, to identify its genre የስነ ጽሁፍ ዘውጉን መለየት ማለት ነው. For example, if we are reading a narrative, it means to follow the plot, to try to understand how the author develops characters, how the plot moves, tries to identifying the narrative structure and all this. So to state it negatively, it means to refrain from treating the biblical text as a collection of presuppositions, if it actually was written in the literary world of its time ማለት ነው. So text-centered approaches, rather than going behind the text, they invested their power on understanding the actual text itself in order to understand how the actual material was organized. So text-centered approach assumes that in addition to the content, the form the content is communicated is also important. So in addition to the actual content that's being communicated, the way it's communicated matters also. So this is what it means to read the Bible as literature. Or text-centered hermeneutics simply do this. So the first step is always to identify the various genres in the Bible. So we find in the Bible Hebrew narrative, we find poetry, we find prophecy, we find gospel, we find epistles, we find historical narrative in the form of acts, and we also find apocalypse, as you know, is a genre in and of itself. So the first one is to recognize that the Bible includes, or the Bible consists of various genres. So it would be wrong to read, for example, an epistle in a way that we read poems, for example. ግጥምን የምናነብበትና ደብዳቤን የምናነብበት መንገድ ሊለያይ ይገባል ማለት ነው. The basic step of treating the Bible as literature or focusing on the text itself. For example, if you read poems, you expect exaggeration, you expect hyperbole, you expect imaginative elements way more than you expect them in epistles. So the first step is to always identify the genre of the Bible. These are the major genres, but there are also subgenres, which are mini genres. For example, we find hyperbole in the Bible. ግነት የምንለው ማለት ነው. For example, think of 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 40. So it says that all the people went up after him, playing flutes and rejoicing greatly, so that the ground shook with the sound. So the point trying to be communicated artistically is that the noise was loud, right? the earth was shook የሚለው is a metaphor. It's a hyperbole. It doesn't literally mean that the actual ground shook. We find also, for example, euphemism is a subgenre. Euphemism means trying to trying to conceal what's deemed as taboo or unspeakable. For example, uh, rather than saying someone died, for example, they might say that someone went to sleep, something like that. We, for example, find archetypes, that is, characters, symbols, and themes that, for example, appear regularly. Those are literary skills, those are literary styles. So the biblical writers employ subgenres like this also. So text-centered hermeneutics focuses on this kind of aspects in the finished text. It tries to identify what kind of subgenres are employed. It tells us how a certain message is being communicated rather than only stating what is being communicated. It tells us how it actually is communicated. For text-centered hermeneutics, the how of it matters, just like the content of it matters as well ማለት ነው። So for example, just like for example, there is what we call genre criticism that tries to categorize each text into a genre. ዘውጉን አንደርስታንድ ማድረግ ስለሚረዳ ማለት ነው። So literature is best understood whenever it's read in the literary conventions of the time. For example, think of poems. Poems, for example, in Ethiopia ወይም የአማርኛ ግጥሞች ቤት መምታት አለባቸው, right? They have to rhyme. But that was not the case, for example, when it comes to Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry follows what's labeled as parallelism. Rather than rhyming, it actually follows parallelism. We will talk about that in detail when we talk about Hebrew poetry. So trying to understand genre is important for text-centered hermeneutics. There is also what you call rhetorical criticism. Rhetorical criticism focuses on the communication between an author and reader and tries to understand how the author is arguing, how the author is trying to convince the readers. So rather than the actual wording, the actual content, like how each phrase works and all that, rhetorical criticism rather focuses on the argumentative power of what's being communicated, the rhetorics of it ማለት ነው. So these are text-centered approaches. For example, when we do exegesis, for example, if you are following a historical grammatical method, you might focus on defining each word, right? You focus on how each phrase works, how each clause work, and all that. But rhetorical criticism actually tries to understand how the author is trying to persuade the reader. So it focuses on the argumentative power of what's being communicated. So the text is the focus is on how certain things being communicated, not only what's being communicated ማለት ነው. So another approach you can read. I believe I've assigned rhetorical criticism for you to read. You will find it in Tate's book, I believe. So for example, there are these kind of methods are uh, included in text-centered approach. There is also what we call narrative criticism. Narrative criticism is not an author-centered approach. It's a text-centered approach. So narrative criticism, it tries to study the narrative of it, the narrative of a certain story. It emphasizes how the plot is being constructed. It tries to understand the setting of a text. For example, if you are asked to do narrative criticism on a certain topic, for example, I believe I gave this assignment to last year's students. They tried to understand the plot of the story, the setting, how characters are developed. For example, if you are reading about David and Goliath, narrative criticism emphasizes how the character of David is being built, how the character is being portrayed, and how it's being contrasted with the adversary. It tries to understand the point of view of the writer. That is how what kind of point of view is the actual writer, that is the implied author, is working from. So narrative criticism, for example, is an example of text-centered hermeneutics. genre criticism, rhetorical criticism, methods like this, rather than focusing on what's going on behind the text, they focus on what's actually going on in the world of the text. So the approach that focuses on things like this is what we call text-centered approach. In our exegetical method, we will pretty much try to take advantage of both insights from the author-centered approach and from the text-centered approach as well. So we will, in a way, go to the world of the world behind the text to a certain extent in order to understand the text better, in order to have a context what Asafa labeled as integrated approach earlier. We will try to do that, but at the same time we will also try to understand the given passage in its literary world. For example, Hebrews is an epistle, so we will consider the epistolary conventions of the time. We will try to understand how to treat that specific aspect, that specific passage in light of the epistolary conventions of the time. We will try and take into consideration the subgenres that are being employed, in the text. We will try to identify if there are intertextuality, if you can see intertextuality, if there are OT allusions. So we will try to pay attention to the text itself, to the finished product itself, in addition to considering the author and his world and his ideology and all that ማለት ነው. So the second major approach tries to focus on the text itself and tries to understand the text in its own terms. It doesn't want to spend a whole lot of time exploring the world of the author, but it tries to focus on the rhetorical quality of the text, on the literary element of the text ማለት ነው. So this is what we call text-centered approach. The final one will be reader-centered approach. We will not spend a whole lot of time on reader-centered approach. I think we will give it a maximum of an hour next week, and then we will talk about actually trying to integrate both three elements. And I will give you a set of exegetical steps that I believe take into account both the world of the author, the world of the text, and we as readers as well. And we will by then begin working on our exegetical paper ማለት ነው. Okay, is it clear? Since I cannot see your face, it's difficult for me to judge whether I'm confusing you or whether I'm informing you or whether I'm doing a little bit of both. But if there are questions, ask away, and I will try to tackle them as much as possible. So is it clear what I've been saying so far? Are you guys following me? Or Debella, are you here? You've been unusually quiet today. I hope everything's all right. Or are you not here? Okay, I cannot see you. Yes, Desalegn, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. Greetings, all of you. Thank you, my teacher. Of course, for me, hermeneutics is very broad and very vast, and it's somewhat confusing, but I have been grasping certain points. I'm sure that it deserves a hard work and study. So I will clarify that with the study, how to study. But my question is, can we justify those different interpretative ways with applications? For example, can we apply those all methods with, for example, with our real situations? I think somewhat it may clarify us more, yeah. Just to
Yeah,
make it clear,
I'm not su-
yeah,
okay.
to make it clear, for example, can we apply these all methods to our current situation? For example, if someone is wants to interpret the Bible while preaching or doing some another thing, how can we apply those different methods? For example,
Yes,
the application is very important. Application is very important.
yes, yes. So to apply the text means to actually relate it to our current reality, to apply it to our life, to preach it, and all that. So we will talk about how to apply the biblical text to our lives faithfully uh, in due course. But if you are actually asking, can these methods be used in order to understand the text better? Yes, absolutely. We can't use each method on each passage. So a certain method is more appropriate, for example, on a certain context or on a certain text better. For example, reduction criticism, for example, can easily be applied when it comes to the Gospels, when it comes to First and Second Kings and Chronicles, where there are parallel texts. That is. So, for example, reduction criticism can best be applied there. Source criticism, for example, can be applied almost everywhere. So source criticism doesn't necessarily try to identify each source behind the text, but for example, it can answer. For example, I believe you will take a course on Christian origins, right? And when you take a course on Christian origins, source criticism can be helpful to identify the confessions, creeds that we find in, for example, in the Pauline epistles, which are the very first materials to be written. So, in order to understand what was shared between Paul and his converts, for example, you can apply source criticism. For example, when Paul says something like 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, "This is what I've given you, this is what I've received," it tells us that specific thing being said was a shared consensus among his church, right? So what I'm saying is that each method has its own place. So I'm giving you these things not to apply it on every possible text. That simply cannot be done. But each method becomes appropriate for a different scenario. So just be familiar with it. Just know what these things are, and you will apply them uh, in due course when they become necessary. For example, rhetorical criticism, which is one of the one of the most I mean, most might be wrong, but which is a very popular approach when it comes to epistles, is for example a very preferable way of reading the Pauline epistles. For example, if for example you might apply it when you are working on your thesis. For example, rhetorical criticism can be applied in the Pauline corpus because Paul's letters are very argumentative, and rhetorical criticism is very helpful to identify arguments. And Paul also uh, seems to have been a good rhetorician. He seems to have been familiar with the rhetorical norms of his time. So these methods, you can't apply them everywhere every time, but it's good to be conscious of them. It's good to be aware of them, and you can apply them. So when you deem them necessary. But when it comes to everyday Bible reading, when it comes to preparing for a sermon, uh, I will try and give you an integrated approach that has, for example, 9-10 steps that you will also be using for your exegetical assignment. So you will start from establishing the text, or you will try to implement what we've called textual criticism to a limited sense. So before reading a text, you will try to establish the text. So you will consult, for example, if you have taken Greek, for example, you will consult textual commentaries and establish working static text. And so that would be a very that would be that yeah that you would practice textual criticism to a limited sense, to a very limited sense. And after that, your next step would be to establish, that is to demark your text, that is to identify whether the unit you are working with, the exegetical unit you are working with, can stand alone. So you would be doing text-centered approach in that step, in a way, in a very limited sense, I'm saying, not in a full-fledged sense. But after doing an author-centered approach or a historical critical method in step 1, in step 2 you would practice text-centered approach to a limited sense. And after that, in the third step, you would try to study the historical context and the literary context. So you will do both a historical approach and a literary approach. So the exegetical steps you would follow will consult all these three worlds, and you would also do reader-centered approach, especially when it comes to application. But uh, you know when you learn in academia, you're not only being prepared for your personal Bible study, but you are also being prepared for who knows, for a life in the academia as well. So it's good to know. Where the conversation lies. So that's why I've given you a very brief introduction to, especially the historical critical method, to rhetorical criticism, narrative criticism. I just want you to be familiar with the terms to identify what they primarily seek to achieve. So, yeah. Yes, Asafa, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate the presentation that I've just followed. I'm very happy with the presentation. And my problem is, as I said repeatedly, because I'm just new on the issue
Yes.
on, I said so many times that I didn't have the theological background. That is why some terms are just difficult for me to understand. For example,
I know.
this the generis and subgeneris. These terms,
Genres
would
and
you just
subgenres. Yes.
okay? They try to
Yeah.
just brief me, just simply the meaning. And the other thing
Sure.
that I want to say is, actually, I showed you an email that I couldn't
Okay.
find those examples on exegesis. And one of the books that you suggested us to read, INT.
Okay.
So would you just share us again? Just
Okay. I will do that.
actually, I email you if you might
I
have
will.
seen it.
I will respond to that. Don't worry. I will
Thank you.
respond. About genres and subgenres. genre ማለት የስነ ጽሁፍ ዘውግ ማለት ነው። ግጥም፣ ልቦለድ፣ ኢልቦለድ ምናምን እንደሚባለው የስነ ጽሁፍ ዘውግ፣ የስነ ጽሁፍ ታይፕ ማለት ነው። ሰብ ዣንራስ ደግሞ አነስ ያሉ ዘውጎች የትም ጋር ሊኖሩ የሚችሉ፣ ለምሳሌ እንደ ምሳሌያዊ አነጋገር ግጥሙም ውስጥ ሊኖር ይችላል፣ የድርሰት ውስጥም ሊሆን ይችላል። ራይት ሰብ ዣንራስ አር ሚኒ የሆኑ ዣንራዎች ናቸው። ዣንራ ኢዝ ሜጀር ታይፕስ ኦፍ ሊትሬቸር ናቸው ኢን ዘ ባይብል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ መጽሐፍ ቅዱስ ውስጥ ግጥም አለ፣ መጽሐፍ ቅዱስ ውስጥ ወንጌላት አሉ። ወንጌላት እንደ ዣንራ ናቸው፣ የሂስቶሪካል ናሬቲቭ አካል ናቸው። ግን የራሳቸው ደግሞ ስፔሲፊክ የሚያደርጋቸው ነገር ስላለ ጎስፕልስ ኦፍን ታይምስ እንደ ዣንራ ትሪት ይደረጋሉ። ከዛ ደብዳቤዎች አሉ። ለምሳሌ ደብዳቤ ኢትስ ዣንራ። ከዛ አቡ ቀለምሳዊ ጽሁፍ ምንለው አፖካሊፕስ፣ ዮሐንስ ራእይ ማለት ነው። እሱ አለ ዣንራ ነው። ሰብ ዣንራ ሲሆን ግን አሁን ለምሳሌ ምሳሌያዊ ንግግሮች አሉ፣ ግነት የምንለው አለ፣ ሲሚሊ ምስስል የምንለው አለ። እነሱ አሉ። እነሱ ናቸው ሰብ ዣንራ እና ዣንራ የሚባሉት። we will talk about them in detail, so don't worry. So the second part of the course would be to treat each genre separately. ስለዚህ ኦልድ ተስታመንት ናሬቲቭን እንዴት ማንበብ አለብን፣ እንዴት አፕላይ ማድረግ አለብን የሚለው እናያለን። ግጥምን እንዴት ማንበብ አለብን፣ እንዴት አፕላይ ማድረግ አለብን የሚለው እናያለን። ሶ ያኔ የተወሰነ ዲስከስ እናደርጋቸዋለን። ጉድ እንዳልኳችሁ ሄርሜቲክስ ጀነራሊ ያለው 3 አፕሮች ነው፣ 3 ሜጀር አፕሮች ነው ያሉት በአካዳሚያ ላይ። ስለዚህ ኦተሩ ላይ ሴንተር የሚያደርጉ ከቴክስቱ ጀርባ ያለው ዓለም ላይ፣ ሂስቶሪካል ኮንቴክስቱ ላይ፣ የጸሐፊው አይዲዮሎጂ ላይ፣ እነሱ ላይ ፎከስ የሚያደርግ አንድ አፕሮች አለ። ለምሳሌ ሂስቶሪካል ክሪቲካል ሜተድ የምንለው እዛ ውስጥ መግባት ይችላል። በዛው ልክ ደግሞ ቴክስቱ ላይ ደግሞ በጣም ፎከስ የሚያደርግ አለ። ቴክስቱ እንደ ሊትሬቸር ማየት ላይ ብቻ፣ እንዴት ነው ስነ ጽሁፉ የሚሰራው፣ እንዴት ነው አርጊመንቱ ሼፕ የተደረገው? ስለዚህ ከይዘቱ በላይም ባይሆን ልክ ይዘቱ ላይ ኢምፖርታንት እንደሆነ ያህል ይዘቱ ፎርም የተደረገበት መንገድ ሃው ማተር ያደርጋል ኖት ኦንሊ ዋት ማለት ነው በቴክስት ሴንተር በሆነ አፕሮች ላይ። ስለዚህ እዛ ደግሞ የሚያደርግ ቴክስት ሴንተር የምንለው አፕሮች አለ። ቴክስቱን በቃ እሱን ዲቴይል ቅርጹን ከዚህ ቀጥሎ እንዴት መጣ ምናምን የሚለው ጋር ፎከስ የሚያደርግ። ከዛ ደግሞ ሪደር ሴንተር የምንላቸው አሉ። ጸሐፊው ላይ አንባቢው ላይ ፎከስ የሚያደርጉ አንባቢው በምን አይነት መነጽር ያነባል፣ አንባቢው እንዴት ነው ሪስፖንድ የሚያደርገው የሚሉ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ what we try to do is to understand both three approaches። ከዛ በኋላ እኛ ኤክሰጀሲስ ማለት the actual process of trying to interpret the Bible. Hermeneutics is the science behind it. It's ባለፈው ዲፋይን ስናደርገው hermeneutics is the science and hermeneutics is an art ብለን ነበር አይደል? ስለዚህ it's the science behind it ፕሪሰፖዚሽኖችን ያሉ ሜተዶችን ዲስከስ ያደርጋል። ኤክሰጀሲስ to the actual process the practical aspect of hermeneutics ነው። ስለዚህ ኤክሰጀሲስን ስንሰራ ኤክሰጀሲስ ስናደርግ ሶስቱንም አፕሮቾች ሚስ አውት ሳናደርግ ለመስራት እንዲመቸን ነው። ስለዚህ የጸሐፊውንም ዓለም ኮንሲደር ባደረገ መልኩ የቴክስቱንም ዓለም ኮንሲደር ባደረገ መልኩ ከዛ የራሳችንንም ዓለም ኮንሲደር ባደረገ መልኩ ለማንበብ ነው የምንሞክረው። ስለዚህ ዛሬ ቴክስቱ አካባቢ ያለውን ለመርዳት ሞክረናል። ላስት ዊክ ኦተሩ አካባቢ ያለውን በተወሰነ መልኩ፣ ኔክስት ዊክ ሪደር አካባቢ ያለውን ትንሽ ተነጋግረን ከዛ ስለ ስቴፖቹ ደግሞ በዲቴይል እናወራለን ማለት ነው። አላሰፋን ብቻ ሳይሆን አሁን አሰፋ ስላለ ነው እንጂ ለብዙዎቻችን አንዳንዶቹ ተርሞች ኮንፊውዚንግ ሊሆኑ እንደሚችሉ አስባለሁ። ስለዚህ አይ ኢንካሬጅ ዩ ቱ ሪድ ዘ አሳይንድ ሪዲንግ ማለት ነው። አሳይንድ ሪዲንጎቹን ካነበባችኋቸው ለምሳሌ ስለ ሶርስ ክሪቲሲዝም፣ ስለ ሪዳክሽን ክሪቲሲዝም በዲቴይል ስታነቡ ይገባችኋል ምን እየሆነ እንደሆነ ማለት ነው። ከዛ ኢን ዩር ፈርዘር ስተዲስ ፎር ኤግዛምፕል ማስተርስ መድገም ካሰባችሁ፣ ፒኤችዲ መስራት ካሰባችሁ ነሰሰርሊ ዩ ዊል ኢንጌጅ ዊዝ ዚስ አፕሮች። ለምሳሌ ሶርስ ክሪቲሲዝም ልትሰሩ ትችላላችሁ። ለኤምኤ መመረቂያችሁ ለምሳሌ ሪቶሪካል ክሪቲሲዝም ልትሰሩ ትችላላችሁ እንደ ሜተድ ማለት ነው። ሜተዳችሁ ሪቶሪካል ክሪቲሲዝም ሊሆን ይችላል። ሜይ ቢ ደግሞ ጎስፕልስ ላይ ኢንትረስትድ ከሆናችሁ ናሬቲቭ ክሪቲሲዝም ሊሆን ይችላል ሜተዳችሁ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ቴክስት ሴንተርድ የሆነ ማለት ነው ናሬቲቭ ክሪቲሲዝም፣ ሪቶሪካል ክሪቲሲዝም። አንዳንዴ ደግሞ ቴክስቹዋል ክሪቲሲዝምስ ቢሆን ለምሳሌ የሆነ ቴክስቹዋል ቫሪያንት ይሄኛው ነው መሆን ያለበት የሚል አርጊመንት ሊሆን ይችላል እንትናችሁ። ስለዚህ ልክ ለጠባቡም ለትልቁም እያደረጋችሁ ነው መማር ያለባችሁ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ለሰርት ለኮርስ ሪኳየርመንታችሁም ለዚህ ለቅርብ ለፕሪቺንግ ሚኒስትሪያችሁ ለቢብሊካል ለዲቮሽን ማቴሪያላችሁ በሚረዳ መልኩ ኢንፎርምድ የሆናችሁ ሁሉ ደግሞ ትራይ ቱ ሃቭ ዘ ቢገር ፒክቸር ኦፍ ኢት አስ ዌል ማለት ነው። አካዳሚያው ደግሞ በየት ዳይሬክሽን እንዳለም አንደርስታንድ ለማድረግ እየሞከራችሁ በተለይ እንደዛ መሆናችሁ ሌሎች ኮርሶችን ስትወስዱ በደንብ አንደርስታንድ ታደርጋላችሁ። አንዳንድ ነገሮችን ኢንጌጅ ስታደርጉ ለምን አንዳንድ ነገሮች ላይ ለምን የተለያየ ቪው እንዳላቸው ለምሳሌ ይገባቸዋል። አንዳንድ ጊዜ የሄርሜኒቲካል አፕሮች ልዩነት ነው። ሶርስ ክሪቲሲዝምን ለምሳሌ በጣም እስከ ጥግ የሚጠቀሙ ሰዎች ለምሳሌ የእነሱ የሚቀበሉት ክሪስቶሎጂ የሚቀበሉት ኒማቶሎጂ ትንሽ ለየት ሊልባችሁ ይችላል። ቴክስቹዋል ክሪቲሲዝም የቴክስት ሴንተርድ የሆነ አፕሮች ነው በጣም ፎሎ የሚያደርጉ ሰዎች ሂስቶሪካል የሆነ አስፔክትን ለምሳሌ ብዙ አፕሪሼት ላይ ያደረጉት ሲችሉ ታያላችሁ። ስለዚህ አንዳንድ ነገሮች ለምን እንደሚሆኑ አፕሮች ለመረዳት ራሱ ይጠቅማቸዋል። ብዙ ነገሮች የሄርሜኒቲካል ፕሪሰፖዚሽንስ ውጤት ስለሆኑ ማለት ነው። Okay, if there is no question, let's call it class for today. I will see you next week. Somebody can pray for us. Sorry, ጸሎት እንጀምር ብላችሁ በጸሎት እንጀምር እንጨርስ ብላችሁኝ ላስት ዊክ ረሳው ስንጀምር በክላስ ኦንላይን ስለሆነ ክላስ ስለማይመስል ነው። So if anyone is willing to pray for us to close the session with prayer, please do that. ድምፁን ሰምቼ በማላውቀው ሰው ከሊስቱ ጋር ላይና David, can you pray for us? Okay, I don't think David is here. Taye, can you pray for us? Okay, I guess እንዳላችሁ በማውቀው ልሂድ መሰለኝ። አሴር ወይም ደሳለኝ one of you can pray for us.
Okay, let me pray in Amharic.
Of course.
አባት ሆይ ስለነበረን መልካም ትምህርት የቃልህን ብርሃን ስላለ ነገር ሁሉ እናመሰግናለን። አባት ሆይ ስለረዳህን እናመሰግናለን። አስተማሪ የሆነ መንፈስ እያስተማረ ስላለ ለትልቅ ዓላማና አጀንዳ ቃልህን ለማወቅ በአንድ ስፍራ ተሰብስበን እየተማርን ስላለ ስለዚህ ትልቅ እድል እናመሰግናለን። የመጽሐፍ ባለቤት መንፈስ ቅዱስ ከምንማረው በላይ በልባችን ቃልህን ስለምትተክል እናመሰግናለን። ቃልህን ለመኖር ነው የምንማረው፣ አፕላይ ልናደርግ ነው የምንማረው። የምናደርግበትን ጸጋ በእያንዳንዳችን ላይ ይጨመር።
አሜን።
በጌታ በኢየሱስም ጭንቅላታችን ለማሳበጥ ሳይሆን እግዚአብሔር አባት ሆይ በትውልድ መካከል ተጽዕኖ ለማምጣት ወንጌልን በተሻለ መንገድ ለትውልድ ለማሳወቅ እየተማርን ነው። በሁላችንም ላይ የጥበብና የመገለጥ መንፈስ ስለሚበዛልን እናመሰግናለን። መንፈስ ቅዱስ አስተማሪያችን አንተ ነህ። እስከ ፍጻሜ ትምህርቱን እስክንመረቅ ድረስ በሰላም ነገሮቻችን ስለምታመቻችልን እናመሰግናለን። መምህራኖቻችንን ሁሉ ስለምትጠብቅ ወንድማችንና አሁንም እጅግ ስለምትረዳው በኃይል ስለምታበረታው እናመሰግናለን። ሳምንቱን ተቆጣጠር። በጌታ በኢየሱስ ስም ጸልየን። አሜን።
Amen. Thank you, Asia. Welcome, Samant. See you next week.
Amen. Thank you. See you, teacher.